Good evening, everyone. My name is James Hightower. I'm Director of College Counseling at Germantown Friends School. On behalf of myself, Allison, Nick, and Masale, we'd like to welcome everyone to another evening program in our series of college conversations. This evening, we are going to focus on standardized testing. And we are very excited and fortunate to have Dan Asher with us. Um, Dan is the owner of A Plus Test Prep and Tutoring in Jenkintown, Pennsylvania. When I first came to GFS in 2017, we had already established a relationship with Dan, and I'm very happy and fortunate, or we're fortunate to have continued that relationship with Dan. He's an expert in standardized testing. So again, we want to welcome Dan, and Dan is going to lead us through and facilitate our presentation this evening. Dan?
Okay, great. Thanks for inviting me here to speak, and I look forward to answering your questions. If you have a question while I'm talking, please put it into the Q&A, and one of our team will make sure that I see it and I'm able to respond to it. So I definitely encourage you to put some questions in. I also have questions that some folks submitted beforehand, so I will try to answer those during the presentation, and then if I see that there are other questions that I haven't answered at the end, I'll come back and try to answer those as well. So I have my typical presentation that I usually do, which covers all the aspects of the different college admissions tests. Unfortunately, this year things are very different, so I had to change it around for COVID. So the beginning of my presentation is COVID focused, and then after I get through that stuff, I'll be going back to talk about more in detail about the stuff that we normally have to deal with. Okay, so the first question is college admissions officers, and how are they reacting to the COVID-19 situation? So obviously what we found is that because a lot of kids couldn't take an SAT or an ACT starting in March when we got hit by the pandemic, most colleges decided at some point to go test optional. Now what that means is that it's not a requirement. Most of the time in the past, most colleges have required either an SAT or an ACT test score, but in this case, it's become optional. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what that really means, and I'm going to talk also about the idea of whether the test is going to be something that's these changes are going to be temporary or permanent. So the first thing to consider is that you have to look at it from the point of view of the college admissions offices. And, typically they have, depending on the size of the college, they can have thousands or even hundreds of thousands of students applying. So they generally rely on these tests because otherwise it's very difficult for them to distinguish between two candidates that could both be very, very well qualified for admission. So what's happened at this point is we really can kind of look at it as there are different tiers of colleges. We have the most competitive level, which are the ones that most people are probably pretty aware of. They're kind of the big name schools, like your Ivy Leagues and some of the other more competitive schools. Then you have the next tier down, which are somewhat selective or competitive. And those are schools, let's say, like some of the better public colleges and some of the other colleges that are not quite at the Ivy League level, but are also still competitive. And then beneath that, we have the vast majority of colleges which are actually not that competitive. So for the really competitive schools, they, because it's test optional, not test blind, what that means is they still would like to see scores if possible. So at that level, when we talk about the sort of like 1% of colleges, they're going to want to see scores. If you can't submit scores, they will understand if it's impossible for a student to take a test because of COVID, then they will understand that, but they still prefer to see it. Then when you look at the next level colleges down, like I said, that sort of second tier, they are probably going to be more understanding if you don't have scores to show. They would prefer to see scores, but if they don't see scores, they're, I think, in a better position to, look at those or not look at the scores. Because it is optional. They're generally going to try not to hold it against a student. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of the pros and cons. With the most competitive level, that top 1%, the way it generally works is you need to have very high scores to get in. It's not necessarily going to help you. It's just kind of a requirement. So in other words, like you could have the best scores in the world and still not get into some of those colleges. That's just kind of like a baseline for them. But for the vast majority of colleges, it's not going to make that much a difference if you're looking at like a Temple or something like that. They're going to just look at the application, across the board and look at it holistically. The next question is, what's going to happen down the road? So are these changes, with test optional, are they going to be temporary or permanent? So right now, if the students in the class of 2021, then obviously they're going to be in this test optional environment. As we go forward, there are some colleges that currently the only reason they're doing test optional is because they have to, because of COVID, and they're basically going to turn around and go back to the way things were before. There are some colleges that are doing a 2 or 3 year experiment with test optional. Some colleges were probably planning to do that anyway before this happened, so it just kind of expedited. The schools that are doing the 2 or 3 year experiment, they're going to be able to look at a lot of data, and they're going to be able to determine whether this really helps them having these scores, or whether they ultimately determine that they don't need the scores. Okay, looks like we have a question. Okay, I don't know. I see that somebody raised their hand. So if somebody, if one of our team can help me, I'd be happy to answer the question as it comes through. Okay. So
whoever's asking it, can they type it into the Q&A? That'd be helpful.
Yeah, that would be really helpful. So I just went through this about the categories of colleges, and again, most selective, somewhat selective, and then the least selective. Okay, so the next question is, what does it really mean to be test optional, and how is this going to affect students? So you have to remember that what test optional means is that you're not required to submit scores. So they will allow you to apply, whereas in the past, for a lot of these schools that weren't test optional, you were not even able to apply without scores. Now you can apply without scores. So what that really means is you have to decide whether it makes sense to submit scores or not. And that's the big thing that's going to happen now, and I'll be talking about that more as we go forward. How do you make that decision of whether it makes sense to submit scores or not? Okay, so if you're in the class of 2021, this is probably already pretty much done. So you don't really have to worry about it right now. You either have scores or you don't have scores. And you're going to make your decision based on that. If you're in the class of 2022 or 2023, then you're kind of at the beginning of the process. Obviously 2023, you're not so worried about it right now. You're going to just kind of continue with the normal plan of action of setting up a testing calendar. If you're in the class of 2022, it's still possible that your class will be in the same environment. We don't know, but it's possible you'll be in the same environment with this generally colleges being test optional. Okay, so the thing I mentioned about test blind, we're just going to talk about that for a moment. So there are a few colleges that are test blind, and that means that even if you want to submit scores, they will not be considered. That's a very small number of colleges, but there are a few that are like that. In most cases, they will say that they're optional, and that means that they may be considered. They will be considered if they are submitted, but if they're not submitted, then they'll still consider your application. And this basically what we're going to talk about is how do you know when it's an advantage to submit scores or not submit scores. So I think we have a question. So let me see if I can answer that question. Okay, the question is, are SAT tests being given in the next 6 to 12 months? Okay, so right now, both the SAT and the ACT have dates planned. Some of the tests have been canceled, as you know. So right now, we're just kind of on a, sort of test by test basis. So as the test approaches a test date, then we find out as we get closer to that date whether the test is actually going to occur or not. And one thing to keep in mind about this is it's not up to the college board or the ACT organization. It's up to the schools that administer the tests. So these agencies contract with individual schools. And within the school, you have a test administrator who assembles a team of proctors to proctor the exam. If the situation is deteriorating, an individual school may decide that they're not going to offer the test because it's not safe. So really that's where we are right now. So it's very difficult to project whether the tests are going to occur. But based on what we saw in the spring, I think there's a pretty good likelihood that some test dates will be canceled. And it's also possible that a test will be given in one location on a certain date, but not on at another location. Okay. Okay, so as we go through the presentation, I will come back to these issues surrounding COVID and try to sort of incorporate that into the rest of the information. And again, please feel free to put any questions you have into the Q&A. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about a few myths. One of the myths is that prestigious colleges still prefer the SAT over the ACT. This is a myth that's been around for a long time. It's not true. Right now, all the colleges will consider either the SAT or the ACT. They have no preference about one test or the other. The next common myth is that colleges prefer well-rounded applicants. That used to be the case, let's say 20 or 30 years ago, but now colleges are looking for students that are really examining one or two areas that they're really interested in and getting really involved in those areas. And they're not expecting students to sort of check off every box that they can do everything. They really want to see more, delving into deeply into their specific interests. Okay, and myth number 3, standardized test scores are more important than grades. No, standardized test scores are important, but grades and the challenge level of the courses that students take are the most important thing. And I would imagine at this point, with what's happening with COVID, the standardized test scores will be, they'll may even be a little bit less important, but they're still going to have importance, I think, in certain situations. And ultimately, as a parent, what you have to do is decide which a combination of elements are going to make your student really look best to the colleges. Okay, so let's just quickly go over about the PSAT, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the other tests. So the PSAT is typically taken in October of sophomore and junior years. And I know in some cases students are going to have the opportunity to take them again. If they didn't get to take them in October because of COVID, they're supposedly going to be able to do them in January. Hopefully that will occur for those students that weren't able to take them in October. The point of the PSAT is for you to get some understanding of how your student might do on the SAT at an early date, so you have some idea of whether they need to start filling in some of the gaps in their sort of content knowledge of the general subject areas that are covered on these tests. The PSAT is also used as the National Merit Scholarship qualifying test. Now, the important thing to remember here is if a student is a sophomore taking the PSAT, that's not the test that's going to count. It's their junior year scores that will count for the National Merit Scholarship. The National Merit Scholarship program is a great honor. If a student gets very high scores on the PSAT, they can get either a commendation at a certain level, they can get a semifinalist recognition, and the semifinalist recognition is the one that usually comes out in September of students' senior year. That's when they determine whether the student is eligible for that. If you are a semifinalist, then you can apply for the scholarship, and then you can become a finalist for the scholarship. That is not based on score. So once you become a semifinalist, it goes, they look at other factors beyond that. The scholarship itself isn't that much money. It's a relatively small amount considering what the cost of college is today. It used to be much more sizable relative to the cost of college, but it's still a great honor, and other types of merit scholarships can be earned based on either becoming a National Merit Scholar or having high SAT scores, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The PSAT is scaled on a little bit of a different scale than the SAT. SAT is scaled with a maximum of 800 in each of 2 areas. So you can get a maximum of 800 in math, and you can get a maximum of 800 in the verbal section, which is a combination of 2 sections of the test, the writing and language and the reading portion. The PSAT is a slightly lower scale. The maximum is 760, and they basically use that. There's, as a predictor, they say if you get a 700 on the PSAT, you can expect to get about a 700 on the SAT. It's not exactly true because if you're at the highest end on the PSAT, it's not going to be totally predictive because you can't get up to an 800 on the PSAT. And there are 3 individual scores you can get. Each of the 3 scores on the test go from 8 to 38. And so you can get up to a maximum of 38 on math and on the writing and language and on the reading. Okay, looks like we have another question. Can you receive a merit scholarship based on ACT too? Okay, so the ACT is not part of the National Merit Scholarship Program because that's actually, the National Merit Scholarship Program is tied into the PSAT. That doesn't mean you can't get a merit scholarship in college from an ACT if you have really good ACT scores, but it's not part of this program. So the National Merit Program does not have anything to do with the ACT. Okay, now talking about the National Merit Scholarship Program, it's based on a selection index. And the way it works is, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, you can get a maximum of 38 on each of these 3 areas: math, writing and language, and reading. And note that the selection index is weighed more towards verbal than math because you have 3 scores that you get, and 2/3 are from the verbal sections, the writing and the reading. So as we just saw, a maximum score of 38, that means that you could have 38 in all three areas as a maximum. And what you do is you add those three numbers together and you multiply by 2 to get your selection index score. The maximum score you can possibly get is 228. For the class of 2020 in Pennsylvania, the selection index was of 220 was required to be a semi-finalist. However, something really interesting happened last year with the PSAT scores, and the selection index actually went down. For the selection index you needed to qualify in Pennsylvania went down by 3 points to 217, which is very, very unusual. And you can see that here. So as I mentioned before, you take the three scores, you add them together, and then you multiply by 2 to get your selection index. And what happened last year was, unfortunately, the PSAT scaling wasn't that great. In other words, what happened was the scale was kind of off, and this actually happened a few years ago with one of the SATs as well, where the test was actually too easy. And what that means is it throws off the scale because the scores can get bunched up at the top of the scale. If it's so easy, then you need to have, like, if you get 1 or 2 questions wrong, that's going to have a significant downward effect on your score. So you have to get every single question right to get a perfect score. But if you get one wrong, instead of having a perfect score, you could be down from, instead of a 760, you could get a 740. And that's what happened last year with the PSAT. That really comes down to, unfortunately, the test was not adequately evaluated before it was actually used for real. And unfortunately, that's what happens sometimes. And that's another thing that I should just mention that's really important is one of the reasons that students should take whether it's the SAT or the ACT more than once, whether they take it twice or 3 times, is because you could have a situation like that where the test is just, something's wrong with the test, the scale's wrong. With the PSAT, they only give that, except for this, obviously it's crazy this year with COVID, but generally it's only given once. So if you have one day when every junior takes the PSAT and the scale is off, this is what you can see happen. So you end up with the numbers kind of in the wrong range. And so that something like that could happen on an individual SAT or an ACT. And so you could take the test, and even though you only got 2 wrong, your score could be a lot lower than what you would expect it to be because, you know, like in this case, the test was too easy. So it really does make sense to take the test 2 or 3 times. Sometimes you can, run into an issue like this, or other times you just may not have your best day. So it's important to keep that in mind. Okay. Again, if you have any other questions, please let me know. I'm going to move on to the SAT now. SAT is typically taken in the fall or spring of the student's junior year. And then if they need to take it again, they can actually take it in the summer in between junior and senior years, or in the fall of senior year is typically the last time somebody might take it. And like I said before, the scaled score maximum is 1600. Maximum on each area is 800, and the minimum on each area is 200. So the overall scaled score goes from 400 to 1600. Now the ACT, similar, it's going to be taken typically in the fall or spring of junior year, and students have the opportunity to take it again either in the summer or in the fall of their senior year if necessary. There's a different scale in the ACT. ACT is scaled with a maximum score of 36. And prior to COVID, there were some changes that were planned for the ACT in September of this year. One of them was going to be a single section retesting, and that's been postponed. The idea there is after you've taken the full test one time, you could sit for 1 or 2 or 3 sections of the test, but not take the entire thing in one sitting. And that would have been something where kids would go into like a testing site and take it on a computer. And the idea there was you could focus on the 1 or 2 sections you needed to retake to improve your score. And the ACT claims that they have data suggesting that that score, when you allow section retesting, actually is a better predictor of students' ultimate ability to do well in college compared to not allowing single section retesting. So that's coming. We don't know exactly when that's going to happen. It may in part have to do with how, how we deal with the rest of the pandemic. The second change that was planned is super scoring on the score report. I'll talk a little bit more about super scoring later, but the basic idea is that, excuse me, the score report on the ACT will include your highest score in each of the 4 areas that are tested. And online testing is something that was planned that'll allow students to take it on a computer, again, at a testing site. They also plan to roll out an at-home ACT test, but those things have been postponed again because of COVID. And it's unfortunate because I think there would be a lot of demand for that. But that's still coming and it's not actually online yet. And then we have the SAT subject tests. Okay, we have another question, so let me take a look at that. Okay, question is what do you think is the reason for very high SAT scores in recent years? A perfect score used to be very rare, but now seems more commonplace. That is true. So what happened was when the SAT was redesigned about 4 years ago, and they rolled out the new test, there's definitely been grade inflation on the SAT. One of the things they did was they removed the guessing penalty. And it used to be that if you were to answer a question wrong on the SAT, you would lose a quarter raw point. So the SAT would give you 1 point if you got it right, you lose a quarter point if you got it wrong, and then you would get 0 points if you just omitted a question. They removed the guessing penalty, so now it really makes sense to answer all the questions and not to leave questions blank. But there was sort of a side effect of that made scores higher, and has to do with the way the tests are designed. So there's definitely been an increase in scores, and I think at this point the scores are really too high, but it's not actually going to be changing as far as I can see. So it's true, like for some of the colleges, the most selective colleges, you're seeing scores of like 1,500 or high 1400s, 1,500 is typical for those schools, which did not used to be the case. Okay, SAT subject tests. They're offered in almost all school subjects. There's something called test flexible admissions, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. That means if for test flexible, you can submit different types of tests, not just the SAT or ACT. And so colleges would allow a student to take an SAT subject test. They might say, well, if you take 3 SAT subject tests, we'll take that instead of the regular SAT or the ACT. It's in some cases a math or science major. If you're applying to do math or science or engineering or some other kind of STEM major, they may want you to take these subject tests in an area that's related to the math or science. In most cases, they typically want to see 2 subject tests. When I gave this presentation last year, MIT and McGill were the 2 colleges at that point that were actually requiring SAT subject tests, because for a long time, there were colleges that required the SAT subject test, like the University of California, that was part of their requirement. But MIT recently dropped them, And now if you take the SAT subject tests for MIT, they won't even consider them. So what this points to is that your requirements from one school to the next are going to be very different. So if you have a list of 8 or 10 colleges, you have to look really carefully at what they're looking for. And I'll talk with that a little bit more about that later too. So most colleges now are listing them as either optional or considered. So optional can be read as recommended, and considered can be read as you don't have to submit those scores, but if you do submit them, you know, that could be something that we would look at. But you also don't have to. So it's not necessarily recommended. As far as I can see, the only school that still has them listed as required is McGill. But they are recommended by some of the top tier colleges. So again, you have to do your homework on what they're looking for. Okay, AP exams. In general, AP exams are not required for admissions. Now again, in the situation we're in right now with COVID, with most colleges having a test optional policy, then obviously they're not requiring anything. They're not requiring the SAT or the ACT. AP exams have never been something that's required. However, a score of 4 or above will reflect well on a student. So it might be something that would be good to have. And also some colleges are allowing their use as part of their test flexible admissions policy. So if a college has test flexible policy, that means that they can look at a bunch of different types of tests, not just the traditional SAT or ACT, to meet their normal requirement. Okay, the ACT and the SAT essay used to be, when the SAT essay first came out, and the ACT also had an essay, they were something that some colleges were required and they wanted to look at. But as time went on, fewer and fewer colleges are looking at that essay. So the SAT and ACT essays are generally something that most of our kids do not prepare for. There are a few colleges that would look at them. And also, again, it may be part of a test flexible policy. But the popularity of these two aspects of the essay on both exams is very low at this point. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the timeline, and then I will come back to talk about some of the more global issues about what you need to consider in terms of whether to submit scores, and also looking at some of the test flexible options. So for sophomores, you're going to take the October PSAT. Again, it could be January this year if it wasn't something they were able to take. In May, you might take an AP exam if you're taking an AP course or a course that prepares you for the AP. And then again, you could take an SAT subject test in May or June if you're coming to the end of the course that best prepares you for that test. So for example, if you're taking chemistry as a sophomore, and that's the only chemistry course you're going to take in high school, that might be the time you would want to take the chemistry subject test rather than waiting until you're a junior when you haven't seen chemistry for a while. Okay, and then the summer in between sophomore and junior years. This is a good time to take the practice practice SAT and ACT tests. Now, we offer them at GFS. We have this Saturday, we're doing the proctored ACT. And it's really a good idea to have students, if they don't do it before or during their sophomore year, then they should try to do it in between sophomore and junior years. So they can take a look and see how they do on both of them, and then compare those scores to make a plan based on which test is going to probably be a better fit for them. What we do is we look at both the SAT and the ACT, and we also have another a cognitive skills test we use called MindPrint, which allows us to get a much better idea of whether one test or another is really going to play to the student's strengths. And then based on that, we can help you make a test prep plan. We don't recommend preparing for the PSAT unless there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be able to get close to the national merit cutoff. So as we talked about a few minutes ago, that's right now we're looking at somewhere between 217 and 220. So if you're going to be somewhere in close to that, then it may make sense to prepare for it. Otherwise, we would say don't worry about that and just worry about preparing for the SAT or the ACT sometime in for the spring of your junior year. Okay, so now we're in the junior year. Again, October, there'll be a PSAT. Then January through May, you want to prepare for the SAT or ACT, plan to take at least the first time sometime in the spring. Hopefully you'll take it twice during the spring semester. And again, we talked about it earlier, it's a good idea to take these tests more than once, in part because you might do better on one section one time and better on another section another time. And also because, like we saw with the PSAT, sometimes the scale might be off just because of the way the test was constructed. Spring test dates for SAT are usually in March, May, and June. There used to be a January test, but they got rid of that. So now there's a big gap between the fall and the spring dates. ACT offers tests in the spring in February, April, and June. Students, again, would take AP or subject tests towards the end of their junior year if that's appropriate for them. Summer before senior year, if you're planning to take the SAT or ACT again, so maybe you've taken it once or twice in the spring, but you feel like you want to try it again because maybe you feel like you can get your score up a little bit more in one area or another, then it's a good idea to use the summer, and you can either take the SAT in August or the SAT subject tests, or you could take the ACT in July or in September. And then once you're a senior, at that point, you may, hopefully at that point you're done with the whole thing. Most likely you would be, but in some cases students might want to try it one more time in the fall if they feel like they really need to do that and they just weren't able to. Of course, in this case with COVID, they might not have even had the opportunity to take it earlier because of what was going on with the pandemic, or they just feel like they still need to take another shot at it, and maybe they didn't have enough time to actually prepare for it earlier in their career, academic career. Okay, we have another question. Okay, how soon after taking the test does a student receive the score? Generally speaking, you'll get your score back within about 2 weeks on one of these tests. So, usually what will happen is there's a score release date that's published by the SAT or ACT. And when you register for a test, you'll be able to see what that date is. And then when that date arrives, you can go online to your College Board account and see what your scores are. Okay, another question. Because you're taking the SAT 2 times, can you take the math score from one SAT and the verbal score from another? Yes, that's called super scoring. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But yes, that's the way that works. You can do that. Okay, so we have 2 things that we're going to talk about: score choice and super scoring. So score choice is where the SAT and the ACT allow students the option of choosing which scores they want to submit to colleges. So in other words, if you took the SAT 3 times, you might decide that one of those 3 dates or 2 of those 3 dates represent the best scores for you, and those are the only ones you want them to see. So you could hold back the scores from one of the test dates or 2 of the test dates. So that's called score choice, and you have the option of doing that. And for that reason, like I have at the bottom here, bottom line is don't send any scores to the colleges until you have all the scores in, and then you can decide which scores are the ones you want to use. In general, it's almost all the colleges will allow you to do this. There are a handful of situations where colleges will require you to submit all of your scores. I have a couple of the colleges listed here. Now with the test optional thing going on right now with COVID, that's possible their policies have changed. So you want to check on that. But in general, most colleges will allow you to do score choice. Okay, I have another question. Is it possible, still possible to sign up for the practice ACT this Saturday? You can send me an email. I'll make sure you have my email address. I'll put it up on the screen again. If you want a student to register for that, it's going to be done virtually. We're not doing anything in person right now. So that will be proctored over Zoom on Saturday. Okay, super scoring. So most colleges will allow you to take the highest scores in each section of the SAT for multiple sittings of the test. So that is a reason to take the test more than once, because you may find that on one date you get a better math score and on another date you get a verbal score that's better. Some colleges super score the ACT. It's becoming a lot more common with the ACT than it used to be. The ACT, as I mentioned earlier, is about to, whether they made this change in the fall, where the new ACT score report will include a super score. So the ACT is really pushing the super score. And this has to do, as I mentioned earlier, with this idea of the single section retesting, where the ACT wants people to use the super scores because they feel like having a super score is actually a better indicator based on their research of how the student might do in college, and therefore it gives the colleges more information. Okay, the next question. How do you send the scores once you receive them? Okay, so what's going to happen is when you register for an SAT or ACT, they will ask you at the time that you register, would you like to share these scores with the colleges? And typically, you get 4 free score reports. In other words, when you register for the test, they say you can put down 4 colleges you want these scores sent to, and then they'll send them. But we don't recommend doing that. We recommend waiting until you have all your scores before you send them to any college. So I would say don't put any colleges down. After you have all your scores, you can go to the website for either the SAT or ACT, and you can put in the colleges that you want your score report sent to through their website. Then it'll be sent over to the colleges. You do have to pay for that. It's something like $12 or $13 per score report. So they definitely kind of get you there a little bit, because if you did it initially when you register, you can send it to 4 colleges at no cost. However, that really puts you at a disadvantage because you don't want to submit any scores until you know what they are. Okay, so now I'm just kind of recapping some of the stuff we talked about. All the colleges will accept either SAT or ACT scores. A few top-tier colleges recommend the SAT subject test score, so you want to make sure you understand. I put some examples down here. Again, things have changed with COVID, so you really have to do your homework and check with the individual schools. Like I have MIT on the list here, but they're not even going to be looking at them anymore. And then a good number of colleges will consider SAT scores, SAT subject test scores. Okay. AP exam scores are generally not required as part of the college admissions process. I have 2 examples here of test flexible colleges, Drexel and NYU. In those cases, you could use an AP. And Georgetown accepts AP as a substitute for SAT subject tests. So this is a really important thing. Every college has their own particular policy about test requirements as well as other aspects of the college admission. So you really have to go to the source. You want to either look at the website for the individual college or give the admissions office a call so you make sure exactly what their policy is. And especially now, with so many colleges being test optional, you really want to know sort of what their point of view on the whole thing is. Okay, so here's an example from Drexel, and again, this is what's on their website, and this is what their policy has been prior to COVID. So in their case, they would look at either you could take an SAT and ACT, or you could submit 2 subject tests, 2 AP exams, or even one of these other tests like the International Baccalaureate tests. So that gives you a variety of tests that you could use, and you're not just stuck with the traditional SAT or ACT. And a similar thing with NYU, they have this test flexible policy. So test flexible means you could submit just an SAT, just an ACT, or in their case, 3 SAT subjects, 3 AP exams, etc. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about the difference between the SAT and the ACT. And again, if you have questions, let me know. Then I'm going to make sure that I answer all the questions that people have submitted beforehand as well. So I recommend that just about every student should take a practice ACT so they can compare it to either their PSAT or SAT score. If there's a significant difference in scores, then we'll generally recommend that whichever test the student did better on, that they would prepare for. But we do look at other factors as well to make sure that that's the right choice. Weaker math students may benefit from the ACT specifically because the ACT only has 1 math section where out of 4 sections. So it makes up only 25% of your score. Whereas on the SAT, 2 out of the 4 sections are math, and it makes up 50% of your overall score. So if you're just looking at it from that point of view, that's one aspect. But we look at a number of different aspects. So we look at the overall score, but then we can look at other factors like that to help determine which test is going to make the student look like a better candidate. There's also this cognitive strengths and weaknesses that I mentioned, and sometimes those things can affect as well whether one test or the other is a better fit. For example, generally the ACT is like a faster paced test. If a student works quickly, they might be better off with the ACT. On the other hand, if you have a student that has slow processing speed and it's harder for them to get through as many questions in a shorter period of time, then that may not be the better test for them. Generally, we still suggest that you try out both tests just to see whether that really is the case. Sometimes kids actually think one test is harder than the other while they're taking it, but when they get the results back, it turns out they did better on the test that they thought was harder. Okay, key differences. In the reading, SAT places more emphasis on science passages and includes questions on graphs and charts within the reading section. There are also 2-part questions on the SAT that require a student to identify the line in a passage that provides evidence for the answer to the prior question. And on the writing section, which is basically grammar, punctuation, those kinds of things, again, they will include passages that have questions relating to graphs and charts. The ACT generally is a more straightforward test in that regard. It's not as tricky. On the math, ACT takes a broad but shallow approach and covers a lot more topics than the SAT. SAT puts a heavy emphasis on algebra and data analysis. The SAT itself, actually, it's about 80% of the math is algebra related. Whereas on the ACT, that's not the case. They have a lot more topics that are covered, including geometry, some trigonometry, statistics, that kind of thing. But when you look at the math tests on the ACT, you have to answer 60 questions in 60 minutes. These are more straightforward questions. You don't have to try to parse the word problem as much as you do with the SAT. But so stylistically, the tests are quite different. The ACT does contain a science section, which the SAT doesn't. So on the SAT, you have reading, then you have the writing and language, and then you have 2 math sections. On the ACT, you have first section is English, then math, then reading, and then a science section at the end. So there's a separate section for science on the ACT, but the SAT has similar content, but it's sprinkled throughout all the sections of the SAT. It's not on one specific section. And the other thing to consider is with these science questions, you don't need to have a lot of specific science knowledge. You do need to understand the scientific method, and you will have to answer questions related to like how experiments work, hypotheses, conclusions, and you have to be able to read and interpret the data. That's really what the science questions are looking for. So this is in conclusion here for my typical talk pre-COVID. PSAT is a good indicator, early warning system, and high scores may lead to scholarship offers. Take both SAT and ACT practice exams at the end of 10th grade or in the summer between 10th and 11th grade. Make sure you do your homework and check with colleges because every college is a little bit different in terms of what they're looking for. And don't send any scores to the colleges until you have all the scores. This is my contact information. So if you want to email me or give me a call about any of these things, I would be happy to speak with you or answer your questions. Again, the person who asked about the practice ACT on Saturday, just give me an email and we'll make sure that that is available to you. And I'm going to go ahead and look at the questions that were submitted in advance, make sure I've answered them for you. Okay, one question is about when you would start to prepare for one of these tests. Generally, what we do is we recommend that students, once they've decided which tests they're going to prepare for, we generally start about somewhere between 3 and 4 months before the test. We do one-on-one tutoring. We meet with kids weekly, usually for around 3 months. We have a couple questions about test optional. Like I said, right now, test optional is pretty much, everywhere. Okay, another question was about the essay on the SAT and ACT. In general, it's not something you need to use or include because most colleges are not looking for it. But you do have to make sure you do your homework again and check with the individual colleges because there may be 1 or 2 on your list that would consider it. Next question is, what's the most valuable skill that students typically take away from college test prep? And do you think test prep adds to the anxiety of college? So that's a really good question because all the things that you work on when you're doing this, the test prep, are the basic skills that you need to succeed in college. You're talking about math skills, but you're also talking about your basic reading comprehension. You're talking about basic writing skills and grammar. So those are things that you really do need. And a lot of what's on the SAT is really looking at how you can read deeply and really pull the meaning out of what you're reading, and also the ability to interpret data. So those are the things you will need to do well in college. So in that respect, even though test prep is something that's not part of like the standard curriculum, it can be really helpful for students in preparing them for college. But it's also true that it can add anxiety to the process because, you know, kids generally have a lot going on, and this is just one more thing they have to deal with. So what we recommend is if you're going to do test prep, try to do it at the time where you have a little bit more time available. So don't do it when you have the heavy sports season or when you're going to be involved with the play that's going to take up every spare moment. Like generally we try to plan around that so that students aren't doing test prep when they're kind of in the heat of all that stuff. Okay, I've got a couple more questions here, so let me take a look at that. When I was taking the SAT and ACT 30 years ago, the math questions on the ACT were straightforward, whereas the SAT math questions were often wrapped in a trick. Did I understand you to say this is still the case? Well, the SAT questions are still less straightforward than the ACT. They're not as tricky as they used to be. They're more straightforward than they used to be. So you're not really looking for tricks, but they can be harder to parse. So they're very wordy, the questions on the SAT math. And so it's easy to kind of get lost in the weeds of what the question is actually asking for. And so it really pulls on your reading ability as well. It's not just about the math. And then the other question is, will GFS be hosting any SAT tests in the spring? That's something I'll have to ask one of the GFS team.
I can answer that, Dan.
Please.
We did, for the class of 2021, we had about half of the class that weren't able to do any testing as of the end of the summer. So we did offer the SAT through SAT Day through the College Board in September. So we were glad we were able to give students the opportunity to take it. The answer to the question whether or not we're going to do it to the spring is we don't know. We have to take in consideration the fact that, you know, we're not a test center, so we're not really equipped to do it. Not that we can't do it. So we have to pay attention to where we are in terms of being on campus and following protocols and actually monitoring what College Board is doing in terms of canceling tests, test centers being shut down, and things of that nature. So I know that's a long, pretty much non-answer, but the answer is that we don't know yet. We're not sure. We're not saying no that we're not going to do it, but there's a lot of things that we have to monitor along the way.
I know that, you know, so far what's happened is that some of the students that had the opportunity to take an SAT or an ACT at their own school were more likely to actually be able to do it because those administrations of the test were smaller, and it was, I think, a little bit easier for schools to offer it in a safe environment than in like a large test center where they have hundreds and hundreds of kids coming in. So I can understand why there's a desire to do that, but I think it's hard to know. You know, even with the places that are planning to do it, like I said earlier, it really just depends on the situation, and those decisions don't get made often until kind of late in the game. I heard a lot of people telling me, you know, a couple of days in advance that the test that they were planning to take had been canceled. So that's just something we have to kind of see how it goes. There was one other question about what people think is going to happen with the generally in the future with respect to these tests. So one thing I just wanted to say that I meant to mention, but I haven't mentioned it yet, is that what I've heard from some of the college counselors that I talked to is an analogy that I think is pretty cool, is that when you're applying to a college, you're trying to put your best foot forward and you're trying to present yourself and make the parts of your application stand out that reflect well on you and also reflect on whether you're a good fit for that particular college. And so the analogy is it's a cookie jar, and you want to put like the best, most lovely, nicest cookies in that cookie jar that you're going to be presenting to the colleges. So if the tests reflect well on you and you think it's going to be beneficial, it's going to make you look better, then you might want to put those, those cookies in the jar. On the other hand, if you see that you're not performing that well in these tests and you think it's not going to be an advantage, now that we're in this test optional environment, you may decide not to use the scores. So I think that's a really good way of looking at it. So in the past, when these scores were not optional, basically you had to do it. Now what you can do is you can say, well, I can see how I would do on these tests. I might even take the tests and I might prepare for them and get the scores and try to get the best scores I can. At that point, I will decide whether I want to use the scores or not. So that's kind of where we are now. It's more a question of, how well can I do on the test and whether that information is going to be beneficial to me to include in my application or not. Okay, I've got a couple more questions here. How much does it cost to take each of these tests? I don't know the exact amount. I think it's typically somewhere in the like $70 range. Okay, James, you want to answer that question? Because I don't know exactly how much it costs. They're not that expensive.
Right, exactly. It's between $70 and $80.
Okay.
I don't know the exact amount.
Right. Okay, so something like that.
Yeah.
How above and beyond should we try to take the tests? I have friends who flew to another state. If cancellations keep happening to us, even though other locations may proceed with testing, should we let it be? Or should we try to drive or fly a certain distance to take the test? I don't know, maybe one of the GFS team wants to answer that question as well, as I'm not sure what to advise in that regard.
I think, again, I think that's a personal decision, a personal choice. I can tell you, as someone that's been on both sides of the desk, this is uncharted waters for colleges as well as college counseling offices. But I can tell you, if we continue going down the same road in terms of test centers being shut down and national tests being canceled, I can tell you that no college admissions office in the world is going to expect you to fly to another state or drive to another city for 4 or 5 hours to take a standardized test, whether it's the SAT or the ACT. If things keep continuing, which I hope they don't, and we are seeing shutdowns and things of that nature and tests being canceled, I think we're facing the same thing we faced this year in terms of seeing colleges and universities maintaining their test optional policy and things of that nature. So again, it's a personal choice, but I wouldn't let the pandemic dictate whether or not I go to another state or fly to another state just to take a standardized test standardized test sitting. Confer with your college counselor. We're pretty much in the know in terms of where things are heading, in terms of cancellations, and we definitely personalize each testing strategy for students. So I would say that would be your first move, is to confer with your college counselor.
James, what are you hearing from the colleges about the, how they're looking at the test scores?
Excuse me. I think the biggest question that we're getting from families in terms of that, what are we hearing from colleges in terms of test optional and testing, is if I go test optional, is it truly test optional? And I can tell you that it is. We are hearing that from colleges. I think as we move through this pandemic, and I think you mentioned this earlier, Dan, 30, 40, 50 years ago, when it comes to at least the academic evaluation of an application, basically colleges were focusing on grades, scores, and strength of curriculum. But now with COVID-19, I think what we can anticipate over the next couple years at least is more of a focus on the student writing, recommendations, interviewing skills and things of that nature, and probably a little less on grades and scores. And not that grades and scores aren't going to be important in the process if you do have scores and you're able to do some testing. But I think we're going to see a less of a focus on grades and scores as opposed to what we've seen in the past. But that's the biggest question that we've been getting. You know, if I go test optional, is it truly test optional? And what we're hearing from colleges is that it is. It's going to be legitimately test optional if you don't submit scores.
So it really comes back to which things are going to make you look better on the application.
Mhm.
And it sounds like from what you're saying also, they might be looking at a wider range of elements
Mhm.
more carefully than they
Right.
have in the past.
I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can get a better idea of sort of holistically of what, you know, of the student. Of course, I would imagine that's a lot harder to do if you're you know, a very large university compared to like a smaller liberal arts college.
Absolutely.
You know, that's going to be harder for them. They currently don't have the manpower to do that level of holistic review.
Hmm. Yeah, it's going to be difficult for the bigger schools. We were in a meeting yesterday, um, and it was reported that University of Michigan, for example, their early apps this year are 56,000 applications, and that's early.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's going to be a tough job for the bigger schools.
Another thing that's happening too is that the colleges, you know, when there are a lot of these like ratings, like the U.S. News, et cetera, and they publish their average scores on the SAT and the ACT, and that's going to be another thing that's going to be really affected by this because generally speaking, the higher scoring students are going to be the ones that are going to submit scores, whereas the students that don't score as well won't. So that's going to skew those numbers. Um, you know, and colleges actually, um, the other piece, and I'll stop after this, but the other piece is that colleges advertise the yield, advertise what percentage of the applicants actually end up being admitted and what percentage actually end up going to the college. And with test optional, it's possible that colleges will even get a much higher number of applications than they would have in the past because it's not required that you submit the test scores. So you can imagine that they're going to be inundated with applications. And they're, in a way, they want that because it makes them look even more competitive because they can say, oh, well, you know, you're having even a smaller percentage now of students that are getting admitted. So it's really going to, affect that whole aspect too. Of sort of how it is.
Absolutely correct with that.
Yeah. So, okay, a couple more questions before we finish up here. Let me just take a look. How does one decide whether to take the SAT subject tests or AP tests? I mean, basically, that's something that you need to talk to your guidance department, your teachers about whether those are tests that would be a good fit for you. If you think that you could get a good score in those tests, it might be worth doing. And again, like I said before, just keep thinking about this, cookie jar analogy. If that's something that's going to make you look good and you feel like you could do really well in one of those tests, then it might make sense to do it. On the other hand, if you're not going to do as well, or it's going to take a tremendous amount of effort to prepare for it, you may not want to expend the time. What is considered a good score? One that is worth submitting for highly competitive schools if colleges remain test optional.
That's the $50 million question.
Yeah, right. I don't know the answer to that question. I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now. There are a lot of things that we can't answer with certainty. I can tell you that these highly competitive schools have had, like I said earlier, they're getting higher and higher scores as a baseline. With the test optional situation right now, it's really hard to say how they're going to look at that. Nick wanted to answer the question as well.
Oh, no, I was just clearing it from the.
Oh, okay.
thing.
Okay.
You're doing great.
And then the last question. Do
Yeah,
you,
Dan, if I want to go back to the previous question about subject tests and
oh, sure. Okay. Yes.
support that we offer. I just want to let everyone know that we assign students to a college counselor in 10th grade at the end of first semester. So actually we'll be doing that in a few weeks. And our biggest role in supporting sophomores sort of in this process before they really get into the process in 11th grade is supporting them and helping them with course selection along with their advisor, but also with testing. So if you are a student that maybe has taken a few accelerated courses in 10th grade, for example, between your teacher and your college counselor, we will help guide and support you in terms of whether or not you're prepared to take an AP or prepared to take a subject test. We see less of that with 9th graders in terms of those types of questions. But again, even though a student is in 9th grade and doesn't have a college counselor, we're there to answer questions for 9th graders as well.
Great. Okay, and I was just going to answer that last question. Do you recommend that a student take both the SAT and ACT exams? Generally speaking, I recommend they take the practice exam for the ACT and either practice SAT or using their PSAT score to compare it. So it definitely is something I would recommend that you do at the outset to determine if you're going to take one test or the other. In general, I don't recommend for most kids that they plan to prepare for both the SAT and ACT, although we certainly do have some kids that do take both exams. I think it's better to figure out which test is a better fit for you and then focus your efforts on that one, because it's already enough just to do prep for one test. So that's my point of view on that one. I have, before we finish up here, I have the email addresses of the folks who registered for this, and I'm going to be sending out a copy of the presentation. And I also have a handout that basically includes a comparison of the SAT and ACT exams for you. So I'll send that out as well. And then if anybody if they're not on the list, just send me an email at dan@A+tutoring, and I will make sure to send you those handouts and the presentation. And that's it for me.
Dan, awesome job as usual. We really appreciate you carving out the time to be with us, to speak to our families. I'm sure we have a mixture of 9th, 10th, and 11th grade families with us tonight. Again, if you have any questions, obviously feel free to reach out with Dan, but also reach out to your college counselor. If you have questions in general, obviously about the process. If you haven't been assigned a college counselor yet, reach out to any of us with any general questions regarding the process. Again, thank you for your time, everyone, this evening, and stay healthy.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I really appreciate the chance to talk to parents about these kinds of things. I think that now more than any previous year, you really need to take advantage of the college counseling, because it's just, there's a lot of uncertainty, like I said earlier, and you really need to, there's probably a lot of questions people are going to want to have answered. So I really recommend that you do that. Thanks again. Take care.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye-bye.